Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a pretty heated period, U.S. trade history.
Yeah.
Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico. We're looking at this article. Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico, economic safeguard or trade war catalyst. So we'll be kind of picking apart the arguments, for and against these tariffs,
Right.
what their impact was, and really how they're tied to that whole fentanyl crisis that was kind of gripping the U.S. at the time.
Yeah.
To help break it all down, I've got our expert in global trade and economics with us.
Happy to be here.
So glad to have you. This is a fascinating case study.
It is. It is.
So let's jump right in. The article starts by talking about how the Trump administration really presented these tariffs as like this national security thing,
Yeah.
really aimed at stopping the flow of fentanyl from Mexico and Canada into the U.S. So can you kind of set the stage for us? What was going on with fentanyl back then?
Oh, yeah.
And how did it become this justification for the tariffs?
Well, the U.S. was really in the middle of this awful opioid epidemic. Right.
And fentanyl, this synthetic opioid, way stronger than heroin, it was just pouring over the border,
Yeah.
really fueling this sharp rise in overdose deaths.
Oh, gosh.
So the Trump administration argued that Canada and Mexico weren't doing enough to fight drug trafficking within their own borders. And they said these tariffs, they were a necessary tool to basically pressure them into action.
So it was like hitting their economies to get them to cooperate on drug enforcement.
Exactly.
The article mentioned some pretty scary stats about the fentanyl crisis at the time, right?
Absolutely. The jump in overdose deaths, it was shocking.
Yeah.
And, I think that context is so important because it helps us understand why the administration's reasoning for the tariffs, why it resonated with some people, especially those directly hit by the opioid crisis.
Right.
But on the other hand, for others, it raised these serious questions about the potential blowback, economically and diplomatically.
Okay, so let's get into those potential consequences then.
The article goes on to talk about how these tariffs ended up costing American consumers a lot of money. Can you kind of explain that for us?
Sure. So in simple terms, think of tariffs like taxes on stuff we buy from other countries.
Okay.
When the U.S. slapped that 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico,
Right.
it meant those products became more expensive for American businesses to bring in. And, those extra costs, well, they got passed on to us, the consumers.
So if I was buying, let's say, groceries or a car or even just building materials back then,
Right.
I was probably paying more because of these tariffs.
Exactly. We saw prices go up on a whole bunch of stuff.
Wow.
Everything from avocados to car parts.
Oh, gosh.
And it wasn't just consumers feeling the pinch. A lot of American businesses,
Yeah.
especially in manufacturing and agriculture, industries that really depend on those North American supply chains, they were hit hard too.
Because they were suddenly paying more for all their imported materials.
That's right. They were stuck,
Ooh.
facing higher costs for what they needed.
Right.
And often struggling to pass those costs on to customers without losing business.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Canada and Mexico, they didn't just sit back and take it. They hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Right. So it became this tit-for-tat trade war.
Exactly.
The article really focuses on how American farmers were hurt during this time. What happened there?
Well, Canada put tariffs on all sorts of American farm products, which basically shut off a huge market for American farmers.
Wow.
Soybean farmers in the Midwest, for example, they were really hurt, and a lot of them had trouble finding other buyers for their crops.
Oh, man.
It really showed how tariffs can have these unintended consequences, creating losers even when you're the one setting the tariffs.
Right. It's not so straightforward.
Nope, not at all.
It's a complicated situation with ripple effects everywhere.
It really is. Yeah, it really is a complicated situation.
It seems that way. So we've talked about the fallout, but let's kind of go back a bit and look at those arguments, the ones that were used to support these tariffs in the first place.
Right.
Why did some people think they were a good idea?
Well, there were a few key arguments in favor of the tariffs.
Okay.
People said they were crucial for protecting American jobs, holding Canada and Mexico accountable for drug trafficking, strengthening national security,
Okay.
and in the end, getting better trade deals for the U.S.
So let's unpack those, starting with the jobs argument.
Sure.
How are these tariffs supposed to protect American jobs exactly?
The idea was that by making imported goods more expensive, the tariffs would encourage companies to move production back to the U.S.,
Okay.
which would lead to more jobs in industries like steel and aluminum.
Right.
It was all part of that Made in America push.
Yeah, like a sort of economic patriotism thing.
Exactly.
What about the argument about drug trafficking?
Oh, right.
How did that factor into the support for the tariffs?
Well, as we said earlier, the fentanyl crisis was a huge worry for the Trump administration. They said Canada and Mexico weren't taking it seriously enough, and that these tariffs were a way to really put the pressure on. They framed it as a national security issue, saying that if they didn't address drug trafficking, it was a direct threat to American lives.
So the tariffs were like leverage to force cooperation on border security.
Exactly.
And what about the national security argument?
Yeah.
Beyond just the drug trafficking part?
Well, the administration also said that by relying less on foreign supply chains, especially for important industries like steel and energy, it would make the U.S. stronger, more resilient to economic or geopolitical problems.
Less dependence on other countries.
Right.
More control over our own destiny.
Exactly. And that idea, economic nationalism, that a country should put its own economic interests first, that was a big theme in a lot of the Trump administration's policies.
And lastly, there's the argument that these tariffs were a way to get better trade deals.
Right.
How did that work?
Yeah. The Trump administration saw the tariffs like a bargaining chip in trade talks. By imposing these economic penalties, they thought they could force Canada and Mexico back to the negotiating table and squeeze out better terms for the U.S.
Right.
And of course, this strategy did lead to NAFTA being renegotiated.
Yeah.
And the creation of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
So a win in their book.
I guess you could say that.
So we've heard the case for the tariffs, but obviously there was a lot of pushback too. What were the main arguments against them?
Well, critics said these tariffs would actually hurt American consumers and businesses more than they'd help. That they would damage relationships with key allies and risk starting a much bigger global trade war. They also questioned whether the tariffs were even working, if they were actually achieving what they were supposed to.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure.
We've talked about how the tariffs led to higher prices for consumers.
Right.
But can you say more about how they hurt American businesses?
Yeah. Well, like we said, a lot of businesses, especially those that depend on those North American supply chains, they got squeezed by the tariffs.
Right.
They had to pay more for imported materials, which made it harder for them to compete, especially globally. Some companies had to lay off workers or even shut down completely.
So even within the U.S. economy, the tariffs created winners and losers.
Exactly.
That about the argument that they damaged diplomatic relations.
Well, Canada and Mexico both felt really betrayed by these tariffs. They saw it as a hostile move from a close ally and trading partner.
Right.
It caused a lot of tension and mistrust. And it took a lot of work to fix those relationships and get things back to normal, diplomatically speaking.
So beyond the economic impact, there was a real cost to these relationships, too.
Absolutely right.
And then there was the worry about a global trade war.
Right.
How did these tariffs on Canada and Mexico fit into that bigger picture?
Well, the tariffs on Canada and Mexico were part of a bigger pattern of protectionist trade policies under the Trump administration. They also put tariffs on goods from a lot of other countries. Especially China.
And this made people worry about a sort of domino effect.
Exactly. Critics were afraid that these tariffs would make other countries retaliate, which would lead to everyone becoming more protectionist and ultimately hurting the global economy. There were real fears of a huge trade war that could destabilize markets and cause a global recession.
Wow, a pretty risky gamble.
It was. It was a really risky gamble.
It was. So we've explored the motivations behind the tariffs,
Right.
the arguments for and against them, and some of the immediate consequences.
Yeah.
What about the long-term impact? Did these tariffs actually achieve their goals?
That's something economists are still arguing about, and the answer is, well, it's complicated.
Of course. Well, let's dive into that complexity then.
Okay.
What are some of the things that make it so hard to figure out the long-term impact of these tariffs?
It's hard to separate the effects of these specific tariffs from other things happening in the economy at the same time.
Right.
The global economy is so interconnected.
Yeah.
There were so many other factors affecting trade, investment decisions, how markets were behaving.
So trying to figure out what caused What is really difficult?
Exactly. And then you have to think about how you even define success.
No, that's a good point.
Did the tariffs protect some American jobs, maybe in certain industries?
Right.
Did they make Canada and Mexico renegotiate trade deals? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But were those deals actually better for the U.S. economy as a whole? That's not so clear.
It sounds like there's no easy answer, no clear winner or loser here.
Nope. And I think that's a key takeaway.
Okay.
Trade policy is rarely simple.
Right.
And the consequences of these decisions, the intended ones and the unintended ones, they can stick around for years. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico are a great example of how complicated all of this is.
Absolutely. So where does this leave us? What lessons can we learn from all of this as we think about the future of U.S. trade policy?
Well, for one thing, I think it shows how important it is to really think things through before you make big trade decisions.
Yeah.
You have to carefully weigh the potential costs and benefits, not just for specific industries, but for the whole economy and for our relationships with other countries.
So avoiding rash decisions, no knee-jerk reactions.
Exactly. And it also highlights the need for a smart and strategic approach to trade policy.
Yeah.
One that acknowledges how interconnected the global economy is and how easy it is to create unintended consequences.
So looking at the big picture, playing the long game.
Yes. And finally, I think it emphasizes how important dialogue and cooperation are, both within the U.S. and with other countries.
Right.
Trade policy shouldn't be a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
To find solutions that work for everyone, you need open communication, a willingness to compromise, and a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities of this increasingly globalized world.
A collaborative approach, not an antagonistic one.
That's it. In the end, trade policy is about finding that balance
Okay.
between protecting your own interests and building relationships with your trading partners that benefit everyone.
That's a great point. Well, you've given us a lot to think about today.
Glad to hear it.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights and helping us break down this complicated issue.
It's been my pleasure. These are the kinds of conversations we need to have if we want to deal with the challenges and make the most of the opportunities in today's global economy.
Couldn't agree more. And to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, jump in.
What are your takeaways from this deep dive into the Trump administration's tariffs on Canada and Mexico? Head over to our website or social media channels and share your perspectives. We always love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious.